everybody, and welcome to our Fireside chat of today. My name is Anna Colaps, and I'm member of the cabinet of the Supervisor at the EDPS. I have the great honor today of being in a conversation with Professor Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana Zuboff is Professor Emeritus at the Harvard Business School and the renowned author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, a book that has revolutionized the way we look at the power dynamics in the digital sphere. She was also the first recipient of the Global Privacy Assembly Giovanni Buttarelli Award. Hello, Professor Zuboff.
Thank you. It's to be here with you today.
And greetings from Brussels. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing a feedback. And is that supposed to be there? I'm hearing an echo. That seems better.
Zuboff, let's start with a diagnosis of the problem. What is surveillance capitalism? Where does the notion of surveillance capitalism come from? And what is at stake, really, for us, for our societies and democracies? I would also be interested in hearing whether you detected any significant developments for the better or for the worse since your book was published. For example, do you think that what you observed in the digital economy in terms of trends have been amplified or not during the global health crisis that we've been living? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And let me just say, I want to thank the European Data Protection Supervisor and all of the incredible people who work in this institution. You are really at the vanguard of helping to create the possibility that the digital century will also be a democratic century. And I'm very, very honored to be here with you today. So the surveillance capitalism, very briefly, this phrase was not intended to be melodramatic. It's actually very specific because it combines two elements of a novel economic logic, an economic logic that could only exist in the digital age. Capitalism. We know that capitalism has evolved over the centuries by essentially finding things that live outside the market dynamic, bringing them into the market dynamic as things that can become commodities. That means things that can be sold and purchased, commodities. And surveillance capitalism has emulated the history of capitalism in this respect. What is extraordinary, however, is that at a time in economic history when a lot of people, including a lot of people at the Harvard Business School, worried about the idea, what is there left to commodify? How will capitalism grow and expand? Because it seemed that everything that could be commodified had already been commodified. But it was at Google, in the heat of financial emergency, known as the dot-com bust, that their leaders, engineers, data scientists came up with a realization that identified an entire new territory of commodification. The breakthrough was the idea that human experience itself could be translated into data, human-generated data. And those data could be commodified. Personal information became a commodity in the same way that we think about barrels of oil or tons of wheat. And this is very important to understand, because what that meant was that the systems that we now, talk about with this neutral kind of language, we call them platforms. Don't call them platforms. They're not platforms. They're systems specifically designed to capture and transmit and compute human-generated data. And they have a front end, which is public facing, which is what we interact with, products and services. But what's really going on behind the scenes is a vast system of high speed, high volume signals processing. This is signals processing. These are behavioral signals that are drawn from our lives, as simple as location tracking and as complex as I was just reading about an app called Pray, Pray.com, which is actually passing on the content of people's prayers to third parties, including Facebook and Google, for analysis for targeted ads. So Pray.com is actually Prey.com. And that is just one tiny example of these ubiquitous processes that are now salted throughout the daily experience of nearly every human, certainly every human who is in any way connected to the internet. And these touch points are whether we're online or whether we're walking in our city or in our homes. So
Professor Zuboff, does it have to do with the business model then? I'd like to understand do you think that the problem you're detecting is concentrated on the business model, on the predominant business model on which we built, on which the digital ecosystem is predominantly built on, so based on tracking, as you're saying, based on data extraction and an accumulation, or is it something worse, something broader? You said, I didn't mean to be melodramatic, but do you think it's broader than that? It's broader than the business model, and it's worse than the features of the prevalent business model in the digital economy?
So the point here is that these systems that we refer to as platforms are designed for high volume, high speed extraction, transmission, and computation. And that means that they are, by being designed for volume of data, tons of wheat, barrels of oil, there is no capacity within these systems to understand the meaning of data. All data are treated equivalently, even though all data are not equal. So the capitalism aspect of surveillance capitalism is that high volume, economies of scale, commodification of what we thought of 20 years ago as private information. Now, where does the surveillance come in? And this is where the economic logic becomes unique to the digital age, because the leaders at Google understood from the beginning that if they undertook this massive scale extraction of human generated data in a way that, quote, users, people understood, that they could see it, they knew what was happening, the leaders at Google recognized that everyone would seek a way to withdraw, to hide, to escape. So they understood from the beginning that these systems of massive scale extraction had to be hidden. They had to be conducted through means that were secret, ergo surveillance. Surveillance was essential to the successful accomplishment of the capitalism, the drive for revenue and ultimately profit. Ergo, surveillance, capitalism, you cannot separate the capitalism, the commodification of our lives, from the surveillance, which makes it absolutely essential and helps to explain why the one thing that surveillance capitalists fear, the one thing that they fear is you and your colleagues. The one thing that they fear are the lawmakers of our democratic societies, because you have powers that they do not have. You have the power to make and enforce the rule of law.
Thank
They
you,
are
Professor.
terrified of that because that is the one thing that can kill them.
Thank you so much. I just heard a word that triggered very much my attention. So I'm trying to link also what you're saying with the topic of our conference. So we devoted this conference to the topic of effective enforcement in the digital world, especially of privacy and data protection rules. And my question for you, based on what you just said, is that do you think that the current legal framework is delivering on its promise to effectively protect citizens in terms of enforcement? And what do you think enforcers, you mentioned enforcers, what do you think enforcers from the EU and beyond the EU should prioritize their actions on?
All right, well, let's tackle those one at a time. Is European law working right now to protect European citizens' privacy? Let's ask that question. So I want to run a couple of numbers by you. And this comes from research that you're probably aware of. It was published just a few weeks ago by the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And I want to just give you a couple of numbers that come out of this research. And then let's look at those numbers and ask the question together, is European law working to protect privacy? So this was research on what's called real-time bidding. So we know that the tech giants are continuously, as I've just discussed, amassing vast quantities at volumes that really exceed human imagination of what we used to think of as private information, personal data, to create profiles, to track location, everything in between. And then these targeting data are broadcast to ad markets. That's the real-time bidding. And that's where advertisers enrich the profiles. They bid on the opportunity to place their ad on your screen. So here's a little bit of data. In Europe, Google is the largest real-time bidding company. It's channeling targeting data to 1,058 firms in Europe, which accounts for 14% of all European broadcasts. 14%, that's a big market share. So if you're wondering why European lobbyists are knocking on your door every day of every week, that 14% has a lot to do with it. Now, in contrast, look at America. In America, the targeting data is being broadcast to 4,698, nearly 5,000 firms in the US by Google. And that's 10% of American broadcasts. And by the way, this research only looked at Google. All right, so we see that there are a lot of firms, over 1,000 firms in Europe that are receiving this targeting data, and even many more in the United States. But now let's look at another outcome here, because it turns out from these data, we can assess that legal regimes really do make a difference. The legal regime in Europe is extremely different from that in America, as you all know, and it does make a difference. But does it abolish these operations? No, absolutely not. Does it mitigate them? Yes, it does. So we see in America, for example, that Americans' online activities and location are exposed 57% more than Europeans. In America, broadcasts occur 107 trillion times a year. In Europe, it's 71 trillion times a year. 71 trillion is still a lot. But now let's fine tune it a little bit. The average person in America has their online activity and location data exposed 747 times a day. That's a lot. That's intolerable. What about in Europe? Well, in Europe, the number is 376 times a day. A day. In Germany, it's once for every minute of online activity, for example. So the question I ask all of you is 376 exposures every day of information about you that ranges from the deeply intimate to the location tracking that is perpetual and pervasive. Is 376 times a day good enough? Does that represent European law protecting European privacy? I know what my answer is, but it's far more important for you to consider your answer. In my view, 376 exposures per day is intolerable. And the only thing that makes it seem a little bit better is in comparison to America, where there is essentially no law to impede any of this. And so we see what happens when there is no law. But can we do better, and must we do better? And, you know, the way we answer that question is to ask ourselves, what is at stake? What is at stake?
My initial question for you, what is at stake?
What
But
is
maybe,
at
Professor
stake?
Zuboff, can I just defer this to maybe the last part of our conversation? Because I really wanted to ask you a question, but I'll kindly ask you to be brief on this one, if possible. We are living ages of increasing concentration of wealth and power, also market power, in the hands of few dominant players. You said that explicitly, in a way. So abusive practices, one could argue, that many have argued, based on data extraction and exploitation, are able to reinforce the dominance of these players. My question for you is surveillance capital, well, are we lacking a coherent approach in enforcing laws also, perhaps, between different fields of law? And I'm thinking about privacy and data protection, of course, but also competition. If you could just give me your 2 cents on this one, on what you think, if we're lacking a coherent enforcement that is making the matter worse, in fact, in the digital ecosystem.
Well, look, you know, when you're talking about antitrust enforcement. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
I had a little difficulty
Competition,
hearing you
but
there.
of course, yeah, it's antitrust.
Competition. You know, competition law has to a certain extent been burdened by criteria that come from another century. So competition law has focused on economic harms. And of course, what we see happening as a result of the development of surveillance capitalism as a global institutional order includes, but also goes way beyond mere economic harms. So, do we see concentration? Yes. Do we see economic concentration? Yes. But we see other forms of concentration as well. For example, right now, as we speak, the tech giants have complete domination of the markets that pertain to knowledge production, computational knowledge production, which we call machine learning and artificial intelligence. The global market structure in artificial intelligence is completely dominated by these firms. And that means not only current and future economic power, but it means concentrations of knowledge. And it means what knowledge is produced, because the knowledge that's being produced is the knowledge that they require to advance their commercial and institutional interests, not the knowledge that we require to advance our ability to turn back and mitigate climate change, to advance our ability to solve disease, to solve hunger, to make sure that every person on earth is educated and has proper health care, the things that confront us in our cities, in our families, in our democratic societies, and in every society on earth.
Very much, Professor
We have
Zuboff.
so many problems to face
Yeah.
that we need the digital and the capabilities of learning from data to solve the problems of people, society, and the world. And we are being robbed of that. So the concentration of knowledge production and indeed knowledge consumption among the tech giants is a different kind of lens on the competition problem, a different kind of lens on monopoly. And this is how we have to widen our understanding of competition law and antitrust law in order to be able to embrace these new forms of concentration, which are disfiguring the possibilities of this century. And leading us into what I think of as an accidental dystopia, a dystopia that none of us have chosen, none of us would choose, and that we're all searching for an alternative to.
I think we would need a dedicated lecture only for that. So, and I'll gladly also actually volunteer to take part in hearing from this. But I really want to put another question before the final, where we will hear from you what we can do better, because that's an important conclusion. Before we go there, Professor Zuboff, you've been the first awardee of the Global Privacy Assembly Award, launched last year in memoriam of Giovanni Buttarelli, our sorely missed former European data protection supervisor. What did it mean to you, this award?
Well, this award touched me deeply, an incredible honor, both for its contemporary significance, but also, as I think you appreciate, Anna, because of Giovanni Buttarelli himself, the kind of visionary that he was, the kind of democratic warrior that he was. And there are things about Giovanni's understanding and vision and prescience that we really need right now. And I'll mention just a couple of them. One is that, and you know, I noticed while I was waiting to go live with you, there was a blue box in the corner of my screen that was showing some of the slogans about the conference. And one of them said, enforcement in the digital world. So let's start right there, because it is my belief, and this is a discussion that Giovanni and I had in detail the last time I saw him. And I know that he agreed with this, that we have to stop thinking of the digital world as some other place. That is a fantasy that the tech folks implanted in our brains a few decades ago, and we have to shed that fantasy. There is no digital world. Of course, we have online, we have internet, but the digital world is our world. The digital must live in our house, in democracy's house, in society's house. Everything digital is just another extension of all the things that we do in an advanced, technologically advanced society. So as long as we separate this world, we're giving it special privileges that it has enjoyed, but it never deserved. The digital world collapses into our world, the democratic world, and the rule of law that adheres in our democracies adheres equally in the digital world. Another thing that that was a key part of our discussions the last time Giovanni and I were together, it was around the time when my book was published, when Surveillance Capitalism was published. And it was also when, the GDPR was, had come on stream just the year before. There were a lot of people in Brussels where we were at this time who felt like GDPR was the grand accomplishment. Many dedicated people, many brilliant people had worked for a long time to bring GDPR to fruition. And the idea was, now we pop the champagne, now we put our feet up, our work is done. Giovanni said to me, Shoshana, we didn't understand surveillance capitalism. We didn't understand that GDPR is only the beginning, but it can never meet the challenge of surveillance capitalism. There is so much more we have to do. And we talked about the idea of the life of the law, and that to really take up the challenge of surveillance capitalism as a global institutional order, which is really going head to head with its only true counterpart, and that is the democratic order. To really take on that challenge, we have to understand every legislative endeavor as part of a longer and larger strategic context. That we build a base, and the base gives us the scaffolding for what must come after that, and what must come after that, and what must come after that. And so we have a kind of decade-long framework. At the one end, our goal is to interrupt, abolish, extinguish surveillance capitalism, not just nibble at the edges, not just be satisfied with 376 broadcasts of our lives every day, but to fundamentally interrupt and outlaw these foundational mechanisms, beginning with secret massive scale extraction. But we also recognize that there is what's politically possible. And so we work between what is politically possible and what is functionally necessary, existentially necessary, democratically necessary, building consciously these layers as we move forward. And that's something that I think a sensibility, a kind of vision, a kind of understanding that we really need today. It's not just about enforcing GDPR. It's, yes, absolutely enforcing GDPR, but also understanding it as a foundation for what follows. And I think this is the exciting part of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, that we already begin to see a new chapter. And even with these very substantial and really game-changing pieces of legislation, even here, this is not the whole solution, but it reinforces and gives us a larger scaffolding to move to the next phase.
Well, thank you so much, because we are really reaching, actually we're really run out of time of our discussion, but I think you started projecting your vision already. I wanted to, I don't know if you see the room, but in this room there are academics, practitioners, regulators, policymakers, enforcers, civil society. So my question for you would be, what would be your vision for Hazel? How can we all achieve? And I ask you to be brief on this one, unfortunately, because we have to conclude. How can we all achieve a future that could really be fair and just for everyone? Thank you.
Brava. Thank you, Anna. Well, look, when I say to you that this is not a story about technology, this is a story about power and economic power. And, if this were a story about technology, we would be in dire straits. because we're not going to be able to get out in front of the internet or get out in front of the digital. That's simply not going to happen. We can't do it. Nobody can do it. The issue is the economic logic that has hijacked the digital over the past 20 years. And this is the best news I could possibly be bringing you. This is great news because an economic logic, specifically surveillance capitalism, can be undone. Anything done by people can be undone by people. And by undoing, by interrupting and outlawing surveillance capitalism, once you really understand it, once you really understand how it works, you understand the intervention points that can accomplish the interruption and the abolishing, the outlawing. Well, it really isn't that complex. It really isn't that difficult. It's very doable for our societies. And what that does is create the landscape for the justice that we all seek, for the escape from accidental dystopia that we all seek, for the flourishing, for the shared inclusive prosperity that we all seek. Because right now, this is an economic institution that benefits a very narrow sector of society, that is not solving the problems of people and society, that is not advancing democracy, but is advancing its own interests and solving the problems of its own commercial ambitions. So we have the opportunity to free the digital, to liberate the digital for people, for democracy, for our cities, for our communities, for our healthcare, for our education, for our families, everything that we seek for our planet. That's what's at stake here. And ultimately, what we see with this growing institutional order of surveillance capitalism is it's not satisfied with privacy. It's not satisfied with creating disinformation because its systems are programmed to ignore content in favor of volume, which is the root cause of disinformation. Where it's not satisfied with creating this vast new inequality, the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me. It's not satisfied with being able to manipulate individual and collective behavior remotely so that our societies become more or less angry, polarized, radical, filled with hate, or not at the touch of some algorithmic adjustments. What it's really going for is a head-to-head showdown with democracy itself, with democratically elected officials. We saw it in the EU at the outbreak of pandemic with the Apple-Google exposure notification protocol and the refusal to modify the Bluetooth in order to host the applications that would help our societies with epidemiological research and empower our public health authorities. We saw it in Australia with Facebook shutting down its pages, knowing that many of those pages were emergency and public health related pages, to show its muscle to the Australian government in order to weasel its way out of the fees that it would be charged for using news information that it had stolen years before. So this is a head-to-head confrontation with democracy. This is a ambition to ultimately replace democratic governance with computational governance. This is the kind of future that is in store for us if we fail in our mission.
That's
Thank
very
you.
clear. Thank you, Professor Shoshana Zuboff. And it's been wonderful talking to you today. It's been a great honor. You gave us a lot of food of thought for the future days, months, and years to come. Please all join me in thanking Professor Zuboff for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.